keyboard to advance the slide, or just click off the map? Yeah.
If we can get everybody to take your seats, we're going to get started. Good evening, everybody. I'm Christoph Bauer, Deputy City Manager of the City of Fayetteville. And you're all here to talk about private dams, right? So make sure you're in the same right room? There we go, okay. Good. We obviously, let me see, we have any elected officials? Councilmember Crisp, do you want to wave? No. So we had Councilmember Crisp. I'm sure he'll be back shortly to participate. Sir, I just wanted to recognize you as part of the meeting. Thank you for coming tonight. I didn't recognize you then. So we had a little bit of event a while back. We had Hurricane Matthew, 15 inches of rain in one day, a very short period of time actually. We have 55 dams within the city. 6 of them are actually maintained by the city, 4 of them by PwC, and 45 private dams. And one of our challenges has been how do we respond to those private dams that have been damaged, and doing it in a way that is sustainable, so that when other dams actually have experienced difficulty, we can try to be equitable in our treatment of those future dams as well as the current dams. And that's really what's been part of the challenge that has taken us some time as an organization and as a policy body to take a look at this issue and try to craft a policy that was sustainable. I think some of you came to some of the council work sessions where we had a conversation about this issue, and the council truly struggled with trying to find a way to help people and do it away within the city's resources, and that could be maintained and done moving forward. I also want to mention that we've handed out comment cards and question cards. Once it's full, please do raise your hand like the gentleman over here is doing, and we'll come over and collect it from you so that we can move on with the process tonight. So thank you for doing that for us. So we went through a process in the first couple months of this year of reviewing that policy and coming together with a policy. And one of the pieces that made that a little complex is we did have some federal funds, and we had to truly explore what those federal funds were available for, what we would be authorized, how we'd be authorized to use those, and what limitations existed. So once we got that information to the council, got that clarified, they were able to struggle with a difficult decision of giving us direction as staff about how to move forward. At this time, that policy says that we do not have funding or the authority to actually spend city funds on private dams. But we are here to talk to you about what we can do and how we can help you as a community try to come together in your community to try to address this issue. With that, we've brought on a group. Friesen Nichols is our consulting team over here, Charles Archer, and Mike. I always forget Mike's last name. Waits. I always want to call him Wyatt. I apologize that. It's Mike Waits. They're going to give you a little bit more information about that, and then we're going to respond to as many of your questions as we can in the time allowed. So please do, if you've already given us one question and you get another, just raise your hand. We'll bring you another question card and get it to you, and we'll be responding to those as we move on. So with that, I'm going to get Mike up here, and we'll start giving you the presentation.
Thank you, Christoph, and thanks to all of you for coming out here tonight as well. I appreciate you showing interest in your neighborhood, community. Let me start by going over the agenda for tonight. One thing I'm sure a lot of you have a question on is, how does the city's current dam policy, their new dam policy, how does that apply to private dams? So we're going to go over that. We're also going to look at, within that city's new policy, they're trying to help by providing a financing option for private dam repairs in that policy. So we'll discuss that at length. We'll go over the steps that you would need to go through for that financing option. Some of you maybe have the question of, if this does advance forward and there is repairs done on the dam, what is the design, the permitting, and the construction schedules? What could those look like? We're going to conclude with next steps, and then we also want to talk about Q&A. And as Christoph mentioned, this is being recorded live. It's going to be put on the city's website. We have this one fixed mic here, so we want everybody that's watching this online to be able to hear the questions, hear the answers, and hence the comment cards. You will notice on the bottom of the comment cards, some of you may have questions that don't pertain to private dams. That's those of us who are here tonight. We're here to answer those questions. You may have questions about speeding in your neighborhood, trash collection, various things like that. If you do, just put on there, you can still ask them. Just put your contact information on there and just check either comment or question private boxes. And we won't read those aloud, but we will give those to the appropriate city departments to get back with you. On the sign-in sheet, has anybody not signed in, we're going to use that to follow up with you. So we can bring it to you if somebody hasn't signed in. David, we got a card over here. All right. Let me move to the policy piece of this. This is an excerpt out of the city's new dam policy for private dams. I won't read this to you, but what this says is the city cannot use taxpayers' money on private dams. Moving to the funding side of this, obviously there's the self-funded option. And I know there's challenges with getting organized to self-fund your own dam improvements. The city's new policy has provided a vehicle in there that I think will help you with that. It's called special assessment. What that special assessment means is that the city would pay up front for dam repairs, and they would be paid back by the benefited properties over a period of time. So with that, I'm sure you have questions about, well, who are the benefited properties? How much money is that going to cost? How long will this take? And this flow chart I'm going to walk you through is going to show you how we're going to get those answers. We don't have those tonight. We weren't even sure which dam owners were going to show up tonight. So I'll show you how we'll walk through that process. The first piece of this is this meeting here. We want to walk you through the policy, show you the process. The second part of this is we're going to use the sign-in sheet tonight to identify which communities are here. We're going to send out sample petition language, either to your HOA. If you don't have an HOA, we'll send it to the community. And we're going to ask that you follow up past that petition, whatever bylaws your HOA has or your community has, and then get that back to the city by August 31st. That petition says you're interested in working with the city on this financing option moving forward. One reason we need that back by August 31st is City Council needs to see, is there nobody interested in this? Are there going to be 45 different dam owners that are interested in this? They have to look at this as a whole and look at how are they going to fund this. So we have in there up to 2 months for City Council to evaluate the different petitions they receive, what is that level of interest, and how might they fund these improvements. Assuming that council moves forward and decides to go ahead and start these evaluations, Friese and Nichols, along with city staff, we're going to perform what we're calling evaluations. These would be engineering evaluations, environmental evaluations that are case by case on each dam. Every dam's going to have different issues. You're potentially going to have different notice of violations for your dam. You're going to have different data available. So these case-by-case evaluations are going to depend on what are the problems with your specific dam and what information is already available. These evaluations are meant for us to be able to determine how much is it going to cost to repair these dams to state and federal criteria, and how long might that take. Oh, and that range is 2 to 5 months in there for that. And it's just the more straightforward dams may be on the lower end. The more complex dams that we have to do more data may take more towards the 5-month period. Once we have that information, Friese and Nichols and the city staff are then going to work on identifying who are the benefited properties, and then how much of that total dollar amount gets assessed to each of those different properties. We have 1 to 2 months slotted for that. Once we've done that, it's time for us to get back with this group of people, with the benefited property owners, and show you what we've done, what work we've uncovered, what those costs are, what it would be, who the benefited properties are, how much that assessment would be. And then again, like tonight where we're providing you some sample petition language, we would provide sample petition language for this special assessment and ask that the benefited property owners return that back within 1 month to City Council. And then again, at that point, City Council sees how many dams are interested in pursuing this. They need to look at funding options, and then they need to make the decision of do they move forward with the assessment, the design, and then the construction. Now, some of you, I know that's a lot of information. Some of you may be thinking, okay, well, that's a decent amount of time here. What is the design and the permitting beyond that? So assuming that a special assessment did move forward, the timeline for that is the city is a public agency. They can't just call up an engineer and say, we want to hire you for this. They have to go through a very formal process by state and federal regulations. They have to advertise this. Interested engineering firms have to put together a proposal and submit. The city has to review those proposals, shortlist, interview, and then select the most qualified engineering firm for each project. That process is a 3 to 4 month process. Once the selected engineer is under contract for the design and permitting, we have 4 to 6 months identified for that. And the very simple dam improvements may take 1 or 2 months to design, but the permitting side of this can control the schedule there. Any sort of dam improvements you're doing, dam safety is going to have to review and approve those at the state level. Most likely you'll have North Carolina DEQ that wants to review it from a water quality perspective. You're going to have FEMA that's at the federal level that's trying to review it from a floodplain management perspective. And all of those processes do add time to this, but we have those within the 4 to 6 month range. Once the design engineer's done, they have construction documents complete. The city would then need to select a contractor, and just like selecting an engineer, they can't just call up a contractor and say, we want you to do this. They have to advertise it. Every contractor has to have an opportunity to submit bids on it and award the contract. We have 2 to 3 months for that process. And then you get to constructions. And again, depending on the dam, the specific repairs that are done, it could be on the low end, it could be 4 months. On the high end, it could be a 12-month process. That was a lot of information, so I did want to close with just next steps. The first step to this whole process is the petition. We're going to use that sign-in sheet, so if somebody did not sign in, please do so. We're going to send that to the leaders of the community and ask that they circulate that and get these signed petitions back to the city by August 31st, and it'll come with a letter with instructions of where you send it to and to whose attention. And with that, we're going to get to the Q&A part of our meeting, and he's been collecting comment cards. He's going to read these and then direct the questions to either myself or various city staff that are best to answer those.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Good evening, everyone. Thank you again for coming out. We really do appreciate it. I know this is near and dear to all of your hearts. So are there any more cards out there before we get started? All right. If questions come up as we go through this Q&A, I need another card, raise your hand. Someone will bring you one, jot it down, and we'll collect it from you because we want to try to answer everyone's question as best we can. Questions as best we can. So I've tried to put these in categories as best I could, and so I'm just going to start. What I'm going to do is read the question, and then, as Mike said, I'll direct it to the appropriate person to try to answer your question. So let's start with a good one. They're all good, though. What happened to the tax dollars that we pay? The lake is part of the city. Christoph, sounds like a good one for you.
He always gives me the easy ones. The challenge here is that I believe you that this is what you believe, but these are private assets, and right now our tax dollars, except for those 6 dams identified, do not go to maintain and operating these facilities. In fact, we've got an opinion from our bond counsel that we cannot expend public funds on private dams. So if at any point we actually move forward with this process, where we move to do an assessment and actually spend public dollars for these facilities, they have to become public facilities in order to do that. That means they will no longer be a private lake, they will be a public lake. They'll no longer be an amenity lake, they'll have to be some sort of stormwater or flood control lake, which is a different design criteria. And there'll have to be some transfer of property in order for that to occur. So right now they are private assets, and we actually don't have the right to actually spend public funds on those assets.
right, next question is, when will the City of Fayetteville repair our high hazard dam on Loch Lomond? So, who wants to? Sure.
That's the process we're trying to lay out for you tonight. This is not a quick process, but we're trying to help you understand what process you need to go through if the community around Loch Lomond wants that facility repaired. We're trying to make a path to make that happen. The timelines we've given you, and this is available on YouTube, so if we went through it too fast, you can go to YouTube and you can re-see this. I believe we're going to also put the presentations up as a link. Have we done that before?
We have, yes, we will.
Yeah, so we'll put this up as a link on that same web page. So you can just pull up the actual presentation. You can see the timeline and the steps that we've set out for you. So this is going to be a longer process than you will like it to be, but it is a path. We didn't want to come here and say there's no way. There is a way, but it's going to take some time. It's going to take some effort on your part.
Thanks, sir. Don't go too far away, Christoph. Let me mix it up with him. Rob? A lot of our problems come from runoff from businesses. How can we get them to participate?
Thank you. You can give me the easy ones too.
Yeah.
Again, thank y'all for coming. My name is Rob Stone. I'm the director of the Public Service Department, which used to be Engineering Infrastructure. We understand that there's when as more development comes in, there's perception of more runoff coming downstream. We understand that. The current city ordinance, there's a stormwater ordinance in place. As the development comes in, they have to maintain their water, their stormwater on site. So that's one thing that's in place. Council has a policy in place to help with that. So as we go through and look at these watersheds and as we examine these dams, there are more different things in place that weren't there when these dams were originally designed. So as we move forward and if the process moves forward and look at these designs, those designs of those dams will take into account the additional runoff that's out there and also the additional the height of the water table. We're coming out of a drought from the 80s that, you know, if you've seen it in the last few years, it's rained a lot more than we've had a long time. So as we move forward and as these dams are designed, that will be taken into account.
Thank you, Rob. This is probably sounds like a follow-up question, comment you just made, Christoph, about it becoming a public asset. The question is, how much property will be city-owned besides the lake itself?
And I'll take a stab at this one. Obviously, the design hasn't been completed, so I can't fully answer that question. It's going to be dependent case by case. Typically, when a city spends money on a project, they want to make sure that they own the land that project includes, and then enough adjacent property to where they can maintain it in the future. And if there's a problem in the future, they have enough access to get in there and work on that project. But to be able to answer this is going to be case by case dependent, and we do need to get into the design before we fully know this answer.
This next question is, you say the dams are private assets, but the water running through them is public usage. How do you make the distinction?
Basically, it's property ownership. If it's owned privately, it's a private dam. So yes, the water flows everywhere, but if there's actually someone who has on private property, using private funds, built a dam, it's a private asset. I'm going to go ahead while I'm up here. I've got one that's mine too. The question is, what criteria is used to determine which dams 6 presently were paid for by the city? Let me clarify that. We do have 6 dams, some of which were damaged, that the city has maintained in the past. What FEMA does, the Federal Emergency Management Organization or Association, did I get that right? Close enough, okay. Their criteria for providing reimbursement funds in an emergency situation is that they will reimburse for damage to public assets. So because we were able to demonstrate that we had touched these 6 dams previously with public funds, and we had some public land ownership, they were eligible for federal funding. So we're not using any city funding to repair any dams. We're using some federal funding to repair 2 dams that were broken. And 1 street and a couple of other streets and other assets like that that are clearly public assets. So that's the distinction. You know, how those 6 got to be maintained by the city, I don't, each one of those is a different historical story. I don't know how all of them came into being partially maintained, but because of that historical fact, we were eligible for federal funds to address those issues. We're not eligible for federal funds for any of the other 45 dams.
The next question, regarding dam debris washed downstream, are there DEQ/DENR restrictions concerning its removal? Rob?
The answer to that is yes. There are permitting processes that have to go through to even remove, to go into where an existing dam was and where wetlands affect. When you're looking at a moving body of water, it's considered a jurisdictional stream. Such when you have flowing water, that is a jurisdictional, and that's state and federal regulations on there. So yes, there are permitting processes either through the state DEQ or through the Army Corps of Engineers or either FEMA. So there is a process in place for those.
This one is a 4-part, 4 questions and 1 card, so very efficient. First question is, who owns the property north of Gables Lake that puts the stormwater in the lake?
That's a very broad question. Certainly we can get you some maps, but I think that I'm going to take that question as basically rhetorical. I think your point is that there's certainly upstream properties who contribute water to the watershed. We're certainly aware of that, and we've tried to address it.
The second question was actually answered in the presentation. Who approves the building permit to repair the dam? And that was the point that was made. It's several different agencies, and Mike, you just want to revisit that real quick?
That's the State Dam Safety Board is going to review and approve those plans. The Corps of Engineers is going to review it from the environmental perspective, wetlands, jurisdictional water. DEQ is going to look at it from a water quality perspective, and then FEMA, if it's in a floodplain, which most of these should be, is also going to review it from a floodplain management, floodplain, just flooding perspective.
And the 2 follow-up questions are somewhat related to both of those points. Is FEMA involved in this, and if yes, where did the money go? And number 4 is the Army Corps of Engineers involved in stormwater runoff? Do you want to take the one about FEMA, where FEMA money went?
Yeah, and we've actually received very little FEMA money at this point. All the money that we're spending to repair things actually has to come out of the city first, and then we get reimbursed from FEMA. But as I've mentioned earlier, none of these projects are actually eligible for FEMA reimbursement. We did ask them, we did seek it, but they were not eligible.
And the last question, Mike, I'll throw this to you. Is the Army Corps of Engineers involved in stormwater runoff?
The Army Corps of Engineers perspective on stormwater runoff is they're looking at it from the jurisdiction, what they call jurisdictional waters. So that's the creeks itself, like the bottom part of the creeks is jurisdictional. Before you can do any work in there, like earlier the question about removing debris, you have to let them know what you propose to do, and they have to review it, comment on it, and approve you to do that work. So that pertains to wetlands as well as streams itself, but they're not necessarily looking at the stormwater runoff itself.
All right, the next question. An article in today's newspaper stated that an additional, I think it's $31.86 million was approved for hurricane relief, with the bulk going to 4 counties, and Cumberland was one of the 4 counties. Can this be used? If not, why? Christoph?
I was reading this one.
Additional $32 million. Why can't that be used for these dams?
I think that, well, we've looked at all the programs. We did get some additional funding, but all those fundings are actually directed to specific programs. And I think that this is part of the CDBGR program, which is actually for community development block grant related projects, which helps us replace housing, usually low-income housing that was damaged. So we have received a number of, do you have that one? You have to come up to the mic if you have that information. I'm going to ask Jay Reinstein, our Assistant City Manager, to come up and answer this question. He seems to be better informed on this one than I am.
Yeah, we were just told about those dollars today. I was supposed to be hearing something more either tomorrow or Monday about how those dollars can be spent. Right now, the CDBG DR, or disaster recovery dollars, that's the $35 million we've received, and we are already trying to identify those potential projects and prioritize those over the next few weeks. More information will be forthcoming.
All right, next question. Will the city council consider adopting a new budget line item for dam maintenance and repair for future use?
I got to stop reading while you're reading.
I'll repeat the question. Will the city council consider adopting a new budget line item for dam maintenance and repair for future use?
I haven't heard that they have an interest in doing that at this point. Certainly, they can identify how they want to spend public funds in the future, and that would be a question maybe ask of council members. I do want to point out we did have a couple of elected officials join us as well. In addition to Councilmember Chris, we have Mayor Robertson and Councilmember Deviere, who have also joined us tonight. So they're certainly listening to your questions, and they may be able to answer these, give you their perspective on this question.
The next question is, with existing policy under review, what, if anything, has been changed and made available on public record regarding private lakes and dams? Christoph?
Well, the key change that was made to the policy was actually to allow the city to participate if federal funds or other sources of funds were available. Previous to the change in the policy, the city's only participation for any kind of dam repair was to provide up to a $500,000 loan to communities who wanted to repair. The policy was revised to allow us to actually recognize the availability of FEMA and other funds and give the communities the benefit of that resource. So that's the policy, the big change that was made in the policy.
The policy is available online. The next question is, what percent of property owners have to agree to be assessed for the dam to be repaired?
There's actually two answers to this question. From a legal perspective, the council can use an assessment regardless of the interests of the community. And we actually do assessments now for water and sewer, have done as we rolled out water and sewer. There is no requirement that there be a petition. In this case, the council has expressed an interest in understanding the interests of the community impacted. So they've asked us to ask you whether you have an interest in being assessed. So that gives them some understanding of whether there's political support for them exercising that authority. So what percentage? I think that that's an individual question each council member has to ask. Our recommendation is that certainly the more support you have, the easier that issue will be for them to answer in the affirmative. So we're recommending that you have a percentage of higher than 50%, certainly, but anything higher than that would give it more likely that the council would be comfortable moving forward and supporting an assessment.
Okay, if a lake is a watershed for storm drains, why is it not a responsibility of the city to help maintain that dam? If the lake owners are assessed and pay back the assessment, does the city return the lake back to the lake owners? So that's a two-part question. Rob, do you want to take the first one about the watershed?
As Christoph mentioned previously, a stormwater feature is very different than a lake that is used as a stormwater feature is very different from a lake that's used as an amenity. A stormwater lake that is strictly for stormwater collects it and it fluctuates. It may have no water in it, and it may have, depending on the size and it's needed, it's determined what the size that lake needs to be, and that determines the size of the dam. So when you're looking at the watershed itself, the dam was put there, most of the time that we've seen is for an amenity for the homeowners to have a lake, and that is not used as a stormwater amenity. It functions at it just simply because the stormwater ends up there, but that's no different than if the stream was running without the lake there. It would still move through as it did, as it would normally. What was the second one?
I think the question on the second one was, what happens after the assessment is paid? Does it return back to the lake owners? That's certainly a question that could be answered two ways. You know, one of the challenges is that if it's a public asset, can you transfer it back to being a private asset? But I think the more interesting question is, do you want to do that? You know, if it becomes private again and something happens, part of the challenge the council has is that once we touch one of these things, it's pretty hard to let go. And that's why this has been a very cautious conversation at the policy level. There are 45 private dams in the community. That's a huge potential liability. Not only do we have the challenge with the ones that have been damaged due to this storm, but we have others that are just degrading over time. There are lots of other lakes we used to have. We used to have Rose's Lake, and we've actually been in conversations with the Reconda community about their lake, which is their dam, which has been failing for a number of years. So this is not just a problem that was created by Hurricane Matthew. It's a problem that exists throughout the community, and the potential liability is pretty dramatic. So we're trying to approach this in a very careful way. We can't spend public funds unless it's a public asset. So anytime that we're actually spending that public funds and providing public resources, it would need to be a public asset. Could at some point it be converted back to a private asset? I don't know that I can answer that question.
Next question, if the city and the homeowners association come to an agreement to repair the dam, will there only be one engineer company, or will there be competitive bidding from multiple engineer companies? I think that was addressed in the presentation, but Mike, you want to reinforce it, or?
Yeah, I can reinforce it. The city being a public organization, they can't just go out to one engineering firm and ask for it. They have to advertise it. It goes through purchasing department. It's advertised for a certain amount of time, a certain way. Any engineering firm that's interested submits on it. The city reviews those, and they base the engineering selection on the most qualified.
It's a long question, so just. If residential property taxes support Fayetteville more than businesses, then what is the reasoning for the devalue or drop in tax value on the homes? And without the lakefront, higher taxes homes will be sold or abandoned or rented. We will become a city of rentals of over 5% of residents leave the city each year. Homeowners get people to stay or move here when our lakes are no more. All right. Next question. That's been answered already. All right. The policy says developers that they must stop runoff, but if they don't, the penalty is so weak it's cheaper to pay the fine. Again, I'm not sure if that's a question. what the policy and the fine is?
Actually, there's it's not really a fine. To get your development approved to be able to build it, you have to meet the current council policy for stormwater runoff. So there's not a fine if you just allow it to run off. There are violations that you find along the way for different things, and that there are issues for that. But to get your development even approved, it has to meet the current city ordinance.
And a follow-up to that, not, once the plans are approved, it has to be built according to those plans before they don't get a permit to occupy the building. The next question is, how can you use tax dollars to fix public dams with hopes of reimbursement?
Again, we wouldn't move forward with using public dollars to fix those dams if we didn't have more than just a hope of reimbursement. We've actually confirmed with FEMA that we have eligibility for that reimbursement and the amount of that reimbursement before we move forward.
All right, this was touched on in the presentation. You're getting money from FEMA to repair the other dams. If you approve helping private dams rebuild, where will the money come from? So where will the city get the funds to help rebuild these private dams?
The process as outlined, we basically get that money from the benefited property owners. It'd be an assessment to the property owners who are around the area that benefit from the lake. So the funding, we'd go through and we do an assessment. That assessment would have to be funded from existing city funds, somewhere for the additional engineering services. That would develop an estimate of the cost to repair the dam and would allow us to set up and define what the assessment would be on each property owner. And we could provide that information back to the community. If the project moves forward, that assessment cost would be rolled into the project cost and would be reimbursed through the assessments to the property owners. Did I answer that question?
That's it. Thank you. Next question. If we cut the dam, what are the engineering requirements on letting the stream flow? Will the Army Corps of Engineers participate? Mike, you want to address that?
Two-part answer to this. The State Dam Safety Board is going to want to review the plans. You're going to have a plan of how you come through, and we call it breaching the dam, but how are you permanently going to breach the dam and drain the lake? They're going to see it done in a certain way, only releasing a certain amount of flow at a time, so you're not causing downstream erosion and damage as you drain the lake. The Army Corps of Engineers would also review that, and they're going to, again, look at it from the stream perspective. They typically would look very favorable on removing what they call as a barrier to the stream and the flow perspective.
Okay. This is going to be an assessment question. We live in Loch Lomond away from the lake front and have no access to the lake. Would we have to pay for the dam?
Again, that's part of the analysis that's yet to be done. Once we take a look at actually doing a preliminary pre-design for it and getting an estimate of the cost, the next step would be looking at those properties that are benefited. That's a part of the statutory review. You can't assess somebody except to the extent that they are benefited by that improvement that you're funding. So what we'd do is we'd have to actually, this is actually an answer I didn't give to a previous question. The city would have to pre-fund, again, that improvement through actually getting some debt. They could actually do a revenue bond and then pay back that revenue bond over time to that assessment, but only to those properties that are benefited, and that would have to be identified through the engineering study that's done when the dam is actually reviewed, assessed, and a plan is established. So that's information that we'd share back to the community before asking you the second time to give us your opinion on whether you want to move forward.
This is another question about the details of the assessment. What are the proposed terms of the assessment, and what percentage interest over how many years?
That would be established by council through the assessment ordinance. They do have some flexibility to establish those terms, so those terms have not been established at this time. Certainly would be information we'd share with the community before the council faces that decision.
Rob? What about the immediate health hazards, increase in vermin, snakes, rats, and the smell that's coming to our homes?
Unfortunately, that is a natural process of as the stream reverts back to its natural state in the Wetlands Reform Act. Again, this is private property. The city has no way to, or no mechanism to go in and to clean up any of that. That is actually private property, so that we can't, no different than we can go into anyone's yard and mow their grass. We can't go onto private property and tend to those items.
Are there other questions out here? Got a couple more? Okay. All right. So I'll read the next question. How are the dams / watersheds / lakes not a public asset when the storm drains PWC / City of Fayetteville installed in these neighborhoods directly flow into the storm waters into each one?
Well, I think that's the key thing that maybe some people misunderstand, is that these dams were not installed by the city. They were not installed by PWC. There are some that were, at least 4 that were installed by PWC, but these other 45 were not. Most of them were put in by developers trying to create an amenity in order to make their residential development more valuable. So they weren't installed by the community. They were installed by a developer. And that developer, once they installed them and sold the lots, created an HOA in some cases. Sometimes they did not, but they basically walked away from that asset. And part of our challenge is that the regulations regarding putting in dams has changed dramatically since that time occurred. And a lot of these things were not built to what we would call a modern standard. And since they have not been maintained, they are degrading over time. What we actually regulate, along with the Army Corps and others, is the natural state, which is a stream that has not been dammed by an obstacle. And as you heard our engineer say earlier, the actual preference is to go back to an unobstructed streamway. That's the natural state. So in this case, if we want to do something other than that, we have to find a public reason for doing so.
Christoph, here's another assessment question. How would the assessment work when the homeowners association owns the lake, but the HOA on the other, but not the HOA on the other side of the lake? So there are 2 HOAs, I guess, adjacent to the same lake. One has ownership and the other does not.
Well, the assessment will be to private property owners. So, if there is some commonly owned property, that's not likely where the value is to be assessed. The assessed will go against the private property owners adjacent to or around that lake that benefit from the lake being in place, not necessarily the HOA. Having 2 HOA may complicate our communication process in that we usually work through the HOA to communicate with property owners, but certainly if there are 2, we will work with both.
Are there any other questions out there? Gentleman over here needs a card. All right. The next question is, when the lake was originally built, did the city / county not approve of these facilities? If so, do they not share in the responsibility for these facilities or the lake?
Well, as most of you know, the city a few years ago was much smaller than it is now, and most of these were actually developed when the city jurisdiction didn't go out into these areas at all. So I'm fairly comfortable saying that most of these were certainly not approved by the city. I do not know what the county's process was at that time, and I don't even know actually what the state's review at that time. We'd have to go back and research each one to see when they were constructed and if they were permitted as part of that process. So there's probably 45 different answers to that question.
let me take off my facilitator hat for a second and add to Christoph's question. When a subdivision development is designed and created, you know, it has streets, it might have some park areas, it might have a lake. When the developer of that property goes through the process of preparing the plans for that development, they submit it to the city or county or wherever the jurisdiction might lie. And they're required today, and that has been for several decades now, to state what property is offered to the public being the city or the county, and what is private. So they can, and so the streets typically are offered to the public. And when that subdivision is approved by the city or county, and after it's built, they are accepting the streets for maintenance. The same thing would apply to a dam. It could be offered to the public, to the city or county, when that development is being proposed. And it's noted on the subdivision drawings that are recorded in the Register of Deeds office, what are the public assets and what are the private assets. So that's why it goes back to why there's 45 different answers. You have to go back to the history of the subdivision development when it was created, and again, what standards were in place depending upon how old it might be. So,
One thing I wanted to add that I don't think we adequately covered earlier, and that is timing. We've given you an outline of sort of the timing that we think it's going to take, or we project it's going to take for us to sort of go through this conversation. And then once we go through this conversation, if the council decides to move forward, we've given you an outline for how long it would take to actually move forward with the project to actually repair. One of the issues that is of concern regarding timing is that once a lake has been drained, there is a time frame which you have some authority to have a permit to put a lake back. That's about 24 months once it's drained. After that, you have to go through a wetland delineation. Assuming that any wetlands are actually created or developed during that 2-year process, there's the potential that you might face the additional challenge of having to mitigate that wetland if you try to put the lake back. So it doesn't mean a lake can't go back. It just means it might be a lot more expensive. So we do have some lakes that have been breached in the past, or I guess they're no longer lakes, but they were lakes. They've been breached in the past. And going back 2 years after they have been breached could be a very costly process. So that's something we'll have to evaluate as we move forward in this process. But certainly why we're trying to tighten this up as quickly as we can to move forward, because if we can start the design process and start construction within that 2-year window, it certainly makes it easier than if we don't do so. So just want to make you aware of that window. This is a sort of one-time opportunity, and it's an opportunity that is aging.
more questions? Are there any more questions out there? The question is, if the city does fix the lake, will they also put in an entrance to the lake for public access?
As the council reviewed the policy and distudied the policy, there certainly was a number of council members who expressed that as an interest. That certainly is going to be a question that's going to be answered by the council on a case-by-case basis.
Are there any other questions out there before we wrap this up? Okay, we got one coming. Okay, a couple more coming. Okay, that's why we're here. You can find additional information on the city's website. It's FayettevilleNC.gov. So you can go to that. You can find the resources there. Hopefully it'll be pretty easy for you to navigate. There are a number of projects that the city's working on related to hurricane recovery. And if you go to that, particularly those that have to deal with roads, is FayettevilleNC.gov/roads, and you can see the various projects there. And as this this process continues to unfold, you can find additional information in time there as well. Okay. Okay. This is a question in response to the remark you just made, Christoph, about the 2-year stipulation about the wetlands and when it was created. So the question is, who created that 2-year stipulation, and why was it never mentioned before at other meetings?
That is actually a FEMA requirement. It's one of the FEMA regulations. As you move in, as these areas develop into what they consider wetlands, is part of their acknowledgement to these areas. That's where you come into where once they have recognized this as a wetland, then you have to go through the additional processes. It adds a little permitting items, and also, as Christoph meant, mitigating those. So you may have to find other properties to change that when it no longer can be wetlands. A good example is when a roadway project has to go through a wetland. There is a process that has to go through to mitigate that loss of that wetland somewhere else. Let me correct that.
Sure.
And not FEMA, but the Army Corps of Engineers. I apologize. I had the wrong agency.
Are there other questions coming? One more? Okay. All right, thank you. Take your time. Next question is, since the storm drain runs through my property and it doesn't belong to the city, can I remove it? Rob?
If there's a storm drain there that is conveying water from one property piece to another and it is closed, then you're causing problems for your neighbors, and that can become a civil issue as you flood other areas. If that piece of pipe is there for a particular reason, there are a number of stormwater conveyance systems that are not city maintained. Sometimes developers put in simply because the ordinance requires that you cannot move water over 2 property lines. So there will be, as a developer comes in, that's part of the requirement. They will have to put something in to catch that water before it goes over more than 2 properties. So to answer that question, not knowing the specifics, if you take out a storm drain or stop it up, that could flood a neighbor, and they could have a civil lawsuit against you.
I think the piece I would add to that is that there are storm drain systems that are installed by the developer, and then there are storm drain systems that are installed by the city. And there are private systems and there are public systems. If it's a public system, it's in an easement, and we do maintain it. If it's a private system, it may or may not be in an easement. You would hope it would be in an easement, but sometimes that's not always the case. And if it's a private system, then it doesn't belong to the city. It was put in for the development for the benefit of the community. And it goes back to being a civil issue. One last question was, a city street was washed out and the dirt from the road blocked access to the lake. Would the city be able to fund the removal of that dirt? I think there's 2 parts to this question. One is that one of the things I've learned in this process is that just because you have storm debris in the middle of a creek doesn't mean you can go remove it. We actually had to go to talk to the Army Corps of Engineers to pull some of our garbage cans out of the middle of a creek. So it is a jurisdictional area, and we have to go in and get a permit to actually remove what we think is foreign debris from those water bodies. Now, soil, we've asked them about the ability to go in and remove soil from creeks, and that's not usually something that they'll provide us a permit to do. So that's certainly there's a permitting issue. As far as a funding issue, we don't currently have any funding to go out and sort of rechannelize streams, even if we could get a permit to do so. We are actually getting some funding through the Golden Leaf Foundation to remove some storm debris from banks and other areas where it's created obstruction. And as we look at our creek beds, we are applying for as much funding as we can to go back and sort of clean up those creeks and clean up, again, those areas outside the water, but adjacent to the water that could create problems in the future. But as far as getting into the water itself, that's an area where we simply have a permitting problem. Do you have any? Thank you.
three more questions. Are there any more questions churning out there? If so, raise your hand. Someone will get you a card. What are your plans, the city plans, to remove storm drains from damaging our land since it is private and we have trash running through city pipes? Rob?
See if I can get, what are your plans to remove storm drains from damaging our land since this is private? We have trash running through city pipes. I'm not sure I can answer this. There are no plans to remove any drains. Again, part of when we assume maintenance of a street, part of that is also assuming maintenance of the stormwater infrastructure that is used to move that water from those streets. And sometimes that does move across other pieces till it gets to where we need to for the water to get away from the area. As far as I know, we do not have any plans to remove any storm drains at this time.
Any land that has a stream running through it is public, so how is the city not responsible for stream restoration now?
One item as part of our, the city is permitted for, and I'm trying to remember this, PDES, National, you'll have to help me with it. It's basically a state permit that allows us, that we have to maintain to show that we're not polluting the area. Part of our requirement is to make sure that the streams are moving as well as possible. This is more of a water quality issue than it is a quantity, but that's part of our stormwater piece of our maintenance, is making sure that as the streams can flow and let the water flow as much as possible and keep it clean as possible. So, and again, as Christoph mentioned, when you start getting away into the area where the water usually moves, that gets into another permitting issue. But we do try to make sure the stream moves unobstructed as possible. I'm not sure I answered that one.
For the council members in the room, you'll enjoy the irony of me answering this question. The question was actually, what is the relationship of PwC to the city? PwC, that's a Public Works Commission, is a wholly owned utility that the city does own that operates water, sewer, and electric. They have some dams that actually are part of their having a watershed for actually providing water to the city. So they actually have some dams in place to actually create an opportunity to collect water and treat it and provide it to our citizens. So that's our relationship to PwC, is that they are our homegrown utility.
Are there other questions out there before we begin to wrap this up? All right. So let me thank you all for your questions. Really good questions and really great penmanship. Much better than Tuesday night's group. So I could actually read most of them, so thank you. As we said earlier, the next step in the process is the city will be sending to the Homeowners Association and others that signed up a process to start this petition if you do have an interest in having an evaluation done of your dam to find out what it might cost to improve, to restore it. So that's the next step. Those letters will be going out the next week or so to the Homeowners Association, and you're going to have roughly a month to get that back into the city so they can begin to look at the big picture, so the council can have an idea of what the funding mechanisms might be to address these issues, and a vehicle to help hopefully improve some of your dams. Again, reminder, go to the city's website for information about hurricane recovery, FayettevilleNC.gov. There's information posted regularly there. So again, thank you all for coming out this evening, for sharing your questions. We know this is important to you, and be safe going home. Take care.